Welcome, podcast listeners, to Mind Matters, Unpacking Psychology. I'm your host, Lilly, and today we're diving deep into something foundational and fascinating, psychological disorders. To guide us through this complex but incredibly important topic, I'm thrilled to introduce our resident awry expert, Dr. Marshall. Dr. Marshall, it's great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Lilly. I'm really excited to explore this with you and our listeners. It's a field that touches so many lives, and understanding it better can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. So let's kick things off with the basics. When we talk about a psychological disorder, what exactly are we defining? What makes something a disorder?
That's a fantastic starting point. A psychological disorder is essentially a breakdown in an individual's psychological functioning, which then leads to distress or impairment in their daily life and a response that isn't typical or culturally expected. Think of it as a significant deviation from what's considered normal for that person or their culture.
Breakdown in functioning. Can you give us a real-life example of what that might look like?
Certainly. Imagine someone who used to love shopping at a bustling market, but now every time they go, they experience intense, crippling fear, even when there's no actual threat, forcing them to rush home. That's a breakdown in their behavioral functioning, as it prevents them from doing something they once enjoyed and impacts their daily life. Now, if there had been, say, a bomb scare at that market recently, being fearful and avoiding it for a while wouldn't be considered dysfunctional. The key is the unwarranted and persistent nature of the response.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's not just about feeling sad or anxious sometimes, because everyone experiences that, right? It's about the intensity and impact.
Exactly. It's about where you draw the line between normal reactions and something that truly impairs functioning. Many psychological disorders are actually extreme expressions of normal emotions or behaviors. For example, feeling distressed after the death of a loved one is a perfectly normal human experience. But if that distress becomes so profound and prolonged that it prevents you from functioning for months or even years, then it might indicate a disorder. Conversely, some disorders like mania might not even cause personal distress to the individual, who might feel elated, but they are still in a dysfunctional state.
That's a really important distinction. Now, moving from the what to the how did we get here, the history of how we've understood these disorders is truly fascinating. How have views on psychological disorders evolved over the centuries?
Oh, it's a wild journey through human thought. In ancient times, the earliest explanations often lean towards the supernatural. We see evidence from Egyptian papyri from the 16th century BCE that recognize the brain as the site of mental functions. But often, abnormal behavior was attributed to possession by gods or demons. If someone was behaving religiously, it might be seen as possession by a god. If they were aggressive or bizarre, then demons were blamed. Treatments back then often involved exorcism.
So a lot of spiritual interpretation. When did we start to see a shift towards a more medical understanding?
That shift really began in ancient Greece. The father of modern medicine, Hippocrates, came along and rejected the demonology perspective entirely. He proposed that mental illnesses, just like physical ones, were caused by natural processes such as brain pathology and required appropriate medical treatment. He even classified mental disorders into categories like mania, melancholia, and phrenitis, or brain fever. Even philosophers like Plato, while also considering divine factors, suggested that mentally disturbed individuals shouldn't be punished for criminal acts like others and should be cared for in hospitals.
That's quite progressive for the time. What about the Middle Ages? Did that medical view continue to flourish?
Unfortunately, no, not everywhere. The Middle Ages in Europe were largely a period where scientific knowledge was pushed aside. Supernatural explanations made a strong comeback, and mentally ill individuals were often accused of being possessed by the devil or witchcraft, leading to horrific fates like being burned at the stake. It was a really dark time for mental health care.
That's heartbreaking to hear. But then things must have started to improve eventually, right?
Yes, thankfully, by the end of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, a more humane view began to emerge. Figures like Philippe Pinel in France and William Tuke in England pioneered humanitarian treatment for mentally ill patients, advocating for moral management and establishing retreats where patients were treated with dignity. In the U.S., Dorothea Dix was a pivotal figure in the 19th century. She tirelessly fought for the rights of the poor and forgotten in mental hospitals and jails, leading to legislation that helped states provide better facilities and financial aid for the mentally ill. Her work was instrumental in the mental hygiene movement.
Dorothea Dix sounds like an incredible force for change. It's inspiring to see how far we've come. Now, moving into more modern times, how did we arrive at our current understanding, particularly with the biological, psychological, and experimental perspectives?
This is where things really accelerate. In the late 19th century, with significant technical advancements, contemporary views began to take shape. The biological perspective gained ground with figures like Emil Kraepelin, who emphasized brain pathology as a cause for mental disorders and developed a classification system that was a precursor to our modern Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM.
So, the biological side. What about the psychological and experimental aspects?
Simultaneously, Sigmund Freud introduced psychological factors, suggesting that inner psychological forces like unconscious motives and psychosexual stages could cause mental disorders. This led to his talking therapies. Then, in the experimental arena, Wilhelm Wundt established the first psychology lab in Germany in 1879, proving that psychological processes could be studied scientifically. This paved the way for work by researchers like Ivan Pavlov with his classical conditioning experiments, and John Watson, who showed that all behavior, even maladaptive, is learned and therefore can be unlearned. These different viewpoints really shaped the field into what it is today.
Fascinating how these different strands came together. Now, let's talk about the various psychological models that try to explain mental health issues. Could you break down some of the main ones for us?
Absolutely. There are several key models, each offering a different lens. First, we have the psychodynamic model, proposed by Sigmund Freud. This model suggests that psychological health depends on a balance between our id, ego, and superego. When these are in conflict, it can lead to psychopathology. Childhood experiences and repressed memories play a huge role here.
So a lot about our inner conflicts and past. What's next?
Then there's the behavioral model, which posits that psychological disorders are the result of learned reactions to environmental experiences, often through what's called faulty learning. Think classical or operant conditioning.
Like developing a phobia after a negative experience.
Exactly. Next, the cognitive model introduced by figures like Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck proposes that disorders stem from irrational beliefs, dysfunctional ways of thinking, or biased information processing. It's all about how we interpret the world.
That's a powerful idea, that our thoughts can contribute so much to our well-being. Any other major models?
Yes, the humanistic-existentialist model emphasizes that while people experience psychological conflicts, they also possess an innate ability for self-awareness, to find meaning in life, and to make free choices. It's about insight and personal growth. And finally, the socio-cultural model highlights the significant role of social and cultural factors in the development of mental disorders. Things like daily stressors and even cultural values can influence vulnerability, or conversely, act as buffers.
So it's truly a complex interplay of internal and external factors. This brings me to another important aspect, classification. Why is it so crucial to classify disorders, and how do we go about it?
Classification is essential because our world is full of information, and we make sense of it by categorizing things. In abnormal psychology, classification helps us delineate meaningful subvarieties of maladaptive behavior. It brings order to understanding the nature, causes, and treatment of these behaviors. It's also vital for communication among professionals and for collecting data on how common different disorders are. Plus, it provides the basis for formal diagnoses needed for things like insurance claims or legal proceedings.
That makes sense. It's like creating a common language and framework. Are there different ways to classify, or is it a one-size-fits-all approach?
Great question. There are three main approaches: classical categorical, dimensional, and prototypical. The classical categorical approach, originating from Emil Kraepelin, assumes that all human behavior is either healthy or disordered, and disorders fall into distinct non-overlapping categories with one set of causes and criteria. However, psychological disorders are far too complex for this rigid approach, given the interaction of biological, psychological, and social factors.
So that one didn't quite stick. What about the others?
The dimensional approach views behavior in terms of varying strengths along several dimensions, like emotional stability or mood. So instead of depressed or not depressed, someone might be moderately depressed on a scale. The challenge here is that theorists haven't agreed on how many dimensions are truly needed.
And the last one?
The prototypical approach combines elements of both. It defines a disorder by certain essential characteristics, but also allows for non-essential features that don't change the classification. This is the most favored approach today because it's user-friendly and allows for some flexibility, even though some symptoms can be shared across multiple disorders. This is what you see largely reflected in systems like the DSM.
The DSM, that's a term I'm sure many of our listeners have heard. Can you tell us a bit about its development and what it means for how we understand disorders today?
Absolutely. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, is published by the American Psychiatric Association and is the primary system for classifying psychological disorders in the United States. Its development has been a long process of revisions, with a major landmark being DSM-3 in 1980. This version shifted to an a-theoretical approach, focusing on precise descriptions rather than assumed causal theories, and introduced specific diagnostic criteria to improve reliability and validity. It also brought in a multi-axial system that provided a more detailed five-dimensional view of a patient's condition, looking at everything from the main disorder to personality issues, physical conditions, psychosocial stressors, and overall functioning.
A multi-axial system sounds really comprehensive. So it wasn't just about giving a label, but understanding the full picture?
Exactly. While the multi-axial system has been abandoned in the most recent DSM-5, which came out in 2013, the general principle of a comprehensive assessment remains. The DSM-5 has continued to evolve, becoming more comprehensive, accounting for gender differences in prevalence and symptoms, and, importantly, appraising cultural background. For instance, it recognizes that migrants might perform poorly on diagnostic tests, not due to a disorder, but because of language barriers or socio-cultural stressors. It even includes a cultural formulation interview to help clinicians consider a patient's cultural context.
That's vital for accurate diagnosis and compassionate care. But I've also heard some common criticisms about classifying disorders. What are those, and how do we address them?
Yes, there are valid criticisms. One major concern is labeling. Once someone is labeled with a disorder, they might start identifying with the negative connotations, and society often views mental disorders negatively, leading to stigma. For example, if someone is labeled with schizophrenia, the label can overshadow their individual strengths and weaknesses, reducing their uniqueness. It can even lead individuals to behave in ways expected of someone with that label.
So the label can become more defining than the person themselves. What else?
Another criticism is the loss of information. Classifying someone as depressed or anxious means some unique details about that person are inevitably lost. There are also ongoing debates about whether disorders are discrete entities or exist on a continuum. And then there are concerns about reliability, whether a classification system consistently produces the same results, and validity, whether it actually measures what it's supposed to measure. Earlier DSM versions had lower reliability, though later ones improved. Despite these criticisms, diagnosis is still necessary to understand causes, predict outcomes, and plan effective treatment. So practitioners need to use these systems with caution and always prioritize the individual's personhood over the label.
That's a crucial takeaway. Diagnosis as a tool, not a definition. Dr. Marshall, this has been an incredibly enlightening discussion. It's clear that psychological disorders are a complex but vital area of study, with a rich history and evolving understanding.
Absolutely, Lily. Understanding the meaning, historical context, different models, and the classification of psychological disorders helps us appreciate the journey of this field and equips us to approach mental health with greater empathy, scientific rigor, and a focus on humane, effective treatment.
And that's exactly what we hope to achieve with Mind Matters. Thank you so much, Dr. Marshall, for breaking down such an intricate topic with such clarity and insight.
My pleasure, Lily.
And thank you, dear listeners, for joining us on Mind Matters. Until next time, keep exploring the wonders of the mind.